Hello and welcome to the arcade. You know, every time the season of Halloween rolls around, I can't help but think of my favorite scary video games. Castlevania, Luigi's Mansion, Ghosts and Goblins, these are all great examples. Games that are about hauntings, evil creatures like vampires or witches or zombies, or games themed around murders or mysteries. All of these make the Halloween season really fun for gaming. And to be honest, it feels like there are a ton of games that have these elements that add to a fun Halloween gaming experience without being traditionally based on actual Halloween. The Super Mario games always have haunted levels with booze and dry bones, and a lot of the Call of Duty games have their zombies mode, and even Stardew Valley has the haunted maze, and Golf Story has the haunted golf course at Oak Manor. There are almost too many examples to list. So today I thought we'd talk about what makes a good Halloween game, and then end the video off with some of my personal recommendations. So let's talk about what makes a good scary game to play during Halloween.
Halloween and video games have almost always gone hand in hand. Ever since the 1970s, there have been horror games, with the earliest example that I can think of being Haunted House. The aim of this game was to immerse players in a haunted house and have them feel like they could live out a typical Halloween attraction from the comfort of their own living room. But horror games have evolved dramatically from that. I'd say Silent Hill is a good game to play during October, but it has nothing to do with Halloween. It's more about the psychological horror that can come from loneliness, guilt, and trauma. So in truth, there are a lot of different reasons why a game could be a fun one to play during Halloween. Whether it plays on the tropes and traditions of the season, or immerses the player in a spooky environment or setting, or explores the depths of what really scares us, many games can fit into the category of a good Halloween game. First, what a good Halloween game needs to do is set the mood. It might be the eerie nature of a place like Silent Hill, or it might be the spooky but not scary setting of the mansion in Luigi's Mansion. Or maybe it's just a jack-o'-lantern, bat and crow-infested golf course like in Golf Story. Whatever it is, it's important that each element is conducive to the immersion that the game is going for. Each element needs to complement the other. Speaking of which, it's important to have characters that feel like they could live in the environment or the world that the game has set up. Of course, there's always exceptions to that rule. For instance, in a game you might have a character that feels super out of place, and that contributes to why it feels scary. Like in Zelda 2, this one NPC that just says, "I am error." Something like that can invoke a sense of existential dread. But for the most part, it's easy to think of all the designs from a game like Bloodborne or the Silent Hill series. In Bloodborne, a lot of the designs are unnerving and repulsive. The game uses the element of body horror to evoke fear and disgust from the player. Some of the enemies are based on human body parts, and others look like mutated human beings, or other twisted things you'd only see in your darkest nightmares. The Silent Hill series uses symbolism to trigger an eerie feeling in the player, like how the different enemies and monsters all represent a different part of James's psyche in Silent Hill 2. Each creature has a very purposeful and intentional design, and that's why these are some of the best examples. And on the slightly less terrifying end, you have games like Medieval and Castlevania. Medieval seems to really be going for a jovial take on all of the typical Halloween tropes. It has things like skeletons, witches, warlocks, and dragons, but they're portrayed in a way that feels less scary and more charming. The designs are simple, colorful, and bright, and use a lot of non-right angles and a noticeable lack of symmetry, making it all look very Tim Burton-esque. Castlevania's designs are cool and classic, but in a way that is respectful of the lore of the world and of most of those creatures in general. Castlevania isn't really designed to scare you, but most of the games in the series are a marvel to look at. The attention to detail, especially in Symphony of the Night and Super Castlevania 4, are exceptional. While you probably wouldn't want to visit the places from Castlevania games in real life, it's certainly nice to explore them through the medium of video games, as they are a joy to experience and explore. Some games use an effective mix of light and shadow to scare the player. I'll go ahead and say it, we are all still afraid of the dark. And what's not to be afraid of? The dark represents the unknown, and there's nothing that humans fear more than that. One game I played recently that really scared me was Cry of Fear. In the beginning of the game, you're trapped in complete darkness with only the flash of a camera to find your way through this house. Darkness can make you feel other types of fear too, not just fear of the unknown. For example, in the Amnesia series, the darkness can make you feel claustrophobic. Other games can do this too. But in games you typically don't want to go into the dark, so you try to stay in the light. But often in horror games you'll find that light is scarcely available. So the spaces that you want to be in, the light spaces, feel very small and contained, especially compared to the spaces you do not want to be in, the darkness. Some games use darkness as a central theme of the game and not just part of the atmosphere. Dredge has a system where darkness increases your character's panic, and the higher the panic escalates, the more bad things can happen. Or like in Dying Light, how the zombies become more active and deadly at night, whereas during the day, they're not much more than mindless obstacles. Or a game like Dark Souls or Elden Ring, where a good portion of the game is dungeon exploring, but you are not going to make it very far without a lantern to light your path. The darkness actively inhibits your ability to progress through a particular area, even if it's not an actual wall stopping you from moving forward. It can feel that way when it's done right. And one of the biggest compliments to a scary game is the soundscape that the game creates. Ambient sounds, audio effects, and music will typically all come together to make something really unique, and most of the time eerie or off-putting if done right. Take for example the Walk Through the Woods level of Silent Hill 2. There's the low humming of the ambient nature and the constant pattering of James's footsteps and the occasional snarling roar from something out there beyond the fog. It just wraps you up in a thick blanket of tension and uneasiness. And I feel like most of the music from the Silent Hill series is going for this feeling of ambient uneasiness. But there is some variety in songs like The Day of Night, Never Forgive Me, Never Forget Me, and Promise Reprise. Then there's more upbeat music like the Castlevania series. Castlevania 3 in particular has some amazing songs, especially considering the limitations the composer would have had to work with. Rather than immersing the player in a feeling of uneasiness or eeriness, the songs from Castlevania serve as motivation to keep pushing forward and to defeat the evil that pervades the castles, catacombs, and cemeteries. The songs from Castlevania don't sound happy, but they do sound upbeat, and they help to surge the adrenaline that is required to actually beat any of these extremely difficult games. I also love a lot of the ambient tracks from the Resident Evil series, especially the save room themes like Save Room and Serenity from RE4. There's something so comforting about tracks like this, especially given the context in which you hear them, which is a safe room away from all the horrors of the game's world where you can take a moment to save your game, pause and reflect, catch your breath before moving on to face the next challenge. And aside from music, sound effects are a huge part of what makes horror so immersive. The classic Hollywood horror movie sound effects have influenced a lot of games, like the classic scream sound, creaking doors, scratching noises, and other stuff. But a lot of video games have heavily innovated to find their own sounds and make new things that we would have never thought of or heard otherwise. Like the clickers in The Last of Us. That is a sound that will stick with you for a while if you've ever played those games. The sound is so unsettling and it's used extremely well in the game to not only scare the player, but also warn them via this audio cue that a clicker is nearby. There's also the little sister from BioShock, which is a little less subtle than something like The Last of Us, but nonetheless very creepy, especially since we don't typically expect young girls to say things like this in that creepy of a voice. And then we have something like the witches sobbing from Left 4 Dead. This is another that serves as an audio cue warning the player what is nearby. It works in multiple ways, which makes it really special and effective. It's a warning to the player, a cue that a witch is nearby, and it helps to immerse the player as well because the sound is so well constructed and understood by the player as something scary and something to avoid in terms of gameplay. I've talked a lot about immersion, but mostly in regards to visuals and audio effects and music. But a really good storyline and good world building can be just as vital as all of those things in order to make a good, scary game. From the early days of gaming, players would see things like ghosts, zombies, witches, bats, and so on represented. A lot of times those are portrayed as your typical grunt enemies that, while they don't provide much of a challenge on their own, they can add to that seasonal Halloween feeling in a big way, especially when their design is done so well, like in the Castlevania series for example. The Last of Us does zombies in a unique way too, where they aren't technically zombies, but just infected humans, so it comes across as a fresh take on a tired trope. Although it is still fun to mow down the typical zombie in something like Left 4 Dead, when you have to constantly be careful not to get overwhelmed by sheer number of enemies on screen. And the Super Mario series and even Mario Kart uses bats to provide some immersion too. I like that bats aren't just part of the decoration or background, but actually act as an obstacle, like in this section of Wario's Gold Mine and this spot on Banshee Boardwalk. Speaking of that, the Mario series uses a ton of typical Halloween tropes to add some level variety in both the Mario platformers, Mario Kart, and even golf and tennis games too. But sometimes even a simple jack-o'-lantern is enough to get players into the spirit of the season, especially in something like Stardew Valley, when you actually participate in Halloween traditions with your fellow members of the town. I like how this game encourages you to actually participate in the events and traditions, because it really helps build the sense of identity you have as the player in this town with your own farm, your friends, and potential love interest as well. You really get to feel like you're part of that world, and that's one of the biggest ways that something can really stand out. And one game that portrays vampires and werewolves in an awesome way is The Order 1886. While it wasn't very well received on its initial release, I think it's a great little game with a fun story, decent cover shooting mechanics, and some really cool weapons to play with. Typically, a good game to play during Halloween will also have interesting folklore to uncover or creepy, haunted locations to explore. Aside from the mainline Mario series, there's the Luigi's Mansion series, which has the player control Luigi exploring the different rooms of a haunted mansion, clearing out ghosts with his trusty vacuum. What the first game lacks in length, it makes up for in atmosphere. It is unbelievably good looking for a GameCube launch game, and you can really tell the designers went the extra mile to make the shadows and lighting really complement the interior of the haunted mansion. And then you have games like BioShock and the pretty much haunted city of Rapture. While the ghosts don't look very traditional, the city does give the feeling of a haunted house due to the echoes of the past that continue to creep through every part of the game that the player explores. And then you have something like the never-ending hallway of PT. I don't feel like there's much I have to explain here, it's obviously very creepy, but what I will say is that it's one of the most disturbing video games I have ever seen, and not one that I am very keen to ever play. I'll stick to watching gameplay videos, if even that. Within games that have choice-based narratives, you'll typically see the player's decisions and actions impacting how the rest of the story plays out. Sometimes just the ending, but in a lot of examples you could get an entirely different playthrough from another gamer playing the exact same game. Like the Telltale Walking Dead game or The Quarry, for example. There are so many lines of dialogue and different choices to make, you can't possibly experience everything the game has to offer in a single playthrough. And replayability is something that is highly sought after, not just in horror games, but in gaming in general. And I just feel like that's something that relates really well to the Halloween season too, when you think about all the same traditions that we repeat on a yearly basis. We decorate, we go to costume parties, go trick-or-treating, and watch scary movies. And some of us make YouTube playlists of all our favorite Halloween videos by our favorite YouTubers as well. And video games can fit right into these traditions as well. A lot of people love playing through Slender, the 8 Pages, or Five Nights at Freddy's again when that time of year rolls around, and it's easy to see why. And a couple of great games to play with multiple endings that are fun to play through during October are Dead Rising, Amori, Amnesia, and so many more. It's inevitable that not everyone looking for a game to play during Halloween is going to love every single game that's out there. There's a huge variety of genres and subgenres to pick from. You can try out new games or go back to old favorites. And some people want to steer clear of any kind of challenge and just enjoy something a little easier to pick up. One in this category for me would be Alice Madness Returns. It's mostly a pretty traditional 3D platformer that most players will have an easy time picking up. Or Soma, because it actually has a safe mode that prevents death from in-game enemies. Five Nights at Freddy's might be another one since there aren't a ton of different mechanics you have to get good at. Even a game like Silent Hill 2 isn't really that challenging, although it's not that easy of a game to just jump into. Or one idea could be just playing through all the haunted levels of the Super Mario games, or the Mario Kart games too. Tougher horror games for people looking for a real challenge would probably be games like Castlevania, Dead Rising, Returnal, Dead Space, or Alien Isolation. The challenge of some of these games can put some people off, but if you want to focus more of your Halloween game time on one specific game, picking up a harder game might be a good idea, especially since some of the ones I mentioned can even take dedicated gamers weeks to finish. The Castlevania games have pretty much always been notoriously difficult, but if you spend enough time with them, you'll probably learn the ropes quicker than you think. And the same goes for the Souls games like Bloodborne and Elden Ring. As long as you're persistent, the challenge will gradually and exponentially decline. In Rockstar's Bully, because the game actually revolves around the school year, there is a Halloween mission in the game sort of early on. The character gets to wear a creepy costume and play pranks around the campus of Bulworth Academy. I guess I should also mention the Halloween games. No, not those games, the ones based on the Halloween movie franchise. I don't have any particular memories or fondness for these games. I haven't really tried many of them, to be honest, but I'm obligated to mention them since they do take place on Halloween against an iconic Halloween character, that being Michael Myers from the movies. Some of the hardest horror games for me to play are the ones that have a lot of jump scares. I am just a very jumpy person in general, so jump scares in movies are particularly effective on me. But with video games, it's even worse. I almost broke my neck playing Cry of Fear and Alien Isolation. But there's no denying the adrenaline rush you get from being jump scared, but for me it is just not worth it. I can handle an eerie setting, an oppressive atmosphere, dark and disturbing creepy stuff, but jump scares are gonna give me a heart attack. Games with a lot of tension and atmosphere are also great to play during the season if jump scares aren't your thing. Alan Wake is a good example of this, and one that I watched my brother play through a while back. It has insane atmosphere and really interesting mechanics. It definitely is a horror game and can get kind of scary, but it's more about the mood rather than something jumping out of your screen. Conarium is another one that I discovered through GOG that, while definitely very creepy and unsettling at times, has, I think, 0 jump scares. Little Nightmares is a good one too, although some of the things in it might surprise you. I don't think it technically has any jump scares. But these games and the variety of these games just goes to show you that it doesn't take a jump scare to make an effective horror or scary game. If you can build that atmosphere and tension throughout the game, the player can feel just as scared or unsettled by that, instead of having to change their underwear every 15 minutes like when playing Fatal Frame or Eternal Darkness. One of the aspects or subgenres of horror that I find most interesting is the psychological horror games, like Silent Hill or Fear, where the character's mind is just as vulnerable as their body. Even non-horror games utilize this as well, but it can be extremely effective in horror games, especially when done right with some mind-bending plot twists, like in Silent Hill 2 or Soma. There's something about that exploration of fear and dread that can be so uncomfortable to experience. Yet so many of us are drawn to it for some reason. Facing your fears through video games is a really popular thing these days, and I think a ton of game developers create beautiful experiences for us to play. And a ton of gamers turned indie developers produce some of the more interesting ones as well, like Omori or Iron Lung. Even if it's not something you personally have a fear of, they can help you experience something that might frighten someone else, or at least help you see things through someone else's eyes for a bit. There's a lot to be said for experiencing something scary with a good group of friends. When there's more people, it tends to be easier to get into the spirit of things and go along with the scares, even if you aren't typically that scared or spooked by something. But it can feel good to play along for the season at least. And that's where multiplayer games come in. You have things like Fortnite that have seasonal content based around Halloween. But then you also have co-op games like Left 4 Dead, Obscure, Killing Floor 2, Dead by Daylight, and Hunt Showdown. These are all great spooky games that are actually enhanced when experienced with friends, or at least other real players online. Heck, most of them require other real players anyway, so you might as well make the most of it. So yeah, I mentioned Fortnite. There's always something new each year, a unique set of Halloween events and challenges that offer unique Halloween rewards like skins and outfits and whatnot. But to be honest, even though I said before that playing with a group can enhance the experience, that's not true for everything when it comes to scary games. One of the most terrifying things that there is isolation and loneliness. The absolute most terrifying games that I can think of are all single-player games, best experienced alone in a dark room with headphones on. Playing games with other players, or even with just other people in the same room as you, can lessen some of the impact of the story and scares of games like Resident Evil or The Suffering. So I'd recommend, when you can, if you have a great new horror game you're ready to play, do your best to experience it completely alone. Because more than likely, unless it's a multiplayer only game, solo is the way the developers probably intended for it to be played. And a good rule of thumb is that if you're doing something the way the developers meant, then you're probably going to have a good time with that game. So, after all that blabbing, what are some of the best games to pick up and play this Halloween? For me, I can recommend the following. If you want something psychologically tormenting with lots of different endings to experience, try out Silent Hill 2. If you want something where you can blast bad guys endlessly on your own time, try Painkiller or Dead Rising. If you want to mow down hordes of zombies while strategizing with teammates, try out Left 4 Dead 2. If you want one of the most engaging single-player storylines ever created, try The Last of Us. If you want fast-paced, challenging retro gameplay, try Castlevania 3, Super Castlevania 4, Symphony of the Night, or the Blasphemous games 1 and 2. If you want to try one of the most popular and trendy horror games just for fun, try Five Nights at Freddy's, Slender the 8 Pages, or Escape the Backrooms. And if you want something really social with some of the spooky elements of Halloween, but nothing actually scary, you could try Fortnite if you're into that. And now I'll rattle off a few more of my favorites that I can't really think of a great category for. Soma, Inside, Limbo, Darksiders, Medieval, and Through the Woods.
I honestly don't think that you could go wrong with any of the games that I've talked about today. There are plenty of great spooky and scary games to play during the Halloween season. Horror is not a one-size-fits-all. Everyone has different tastes and different fears, and different things that they want to get out of a horror game. But I believe that the most important things to look for in a good Halloween horror game are atmosphere and art style, haunting soundscapes, engaging storylines, and unique horror elements that other games from other genres don't offer. To really get into the spirit of the season, I believe it's usually best to pick a game that is very immersive and cranks the atmosphere up to the maximum level. I hope I've helped you find something really good and scary to play this Halloween. And even if it's the same old game that you always play every year, hey, that's better than nothing. Let me know what you're playing this Halloween season and what your favorite scary games are in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching.